Yes.
Right, we have already waited for the minimum 5 minutes that sometimes we have to allow in Spain. But as we are the British Chamber of Commerce, I think punctuality is something that we have to keep as much as we can. Good afternoon, welcome everybody. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming the seminar called The Emerging New Geopolitical Order, Can Europe Respond? For those who do not know me, I'm Eva Prada, the Director General of the British Chamber of Commerce in Spain. I will be today introducing the webinar. I will be introducing the speakers, and at the end, I'll be moderating the questions. To begin with, let me tell you about the format of the webinar. I will say a few words, then the two speakers will interview each other in a colloquium format. Then I will open the floor for questions. While the two speakers are talking, I would appreciate if everybody can be in mute, and you can also have your videos switched off so that we don't disturb and we don't cause any sort of disturbance of people's attention. Okay, let me start by saying a few words about the British Chamber of Commerce in Spain, because today we've got a few attendees who are not members of the Chamber. We are the only British-Spanish private business association. We were founded in 1908, and we currently have 300 businesses with us. 60% would be Spanish businesses and 40% would be British businesses in Spain. The relations between the UK and Spain are much stronger than a lot of people know. Bilateral trade is estimated in 60,000 million euro, and the Britain is #1 investor in Spain. It's invested since 2016, since the date of the referendum, has invested over 10,000 million euro and has generated almost 200,000 jobs. If we talk about the Spanish investment in the UK since 1993, the UK is #1 destination for Spanish investment, and the investment stock value is 17,000 million, higher than that of any other EU country to the UK. If we add to these figures the large number of Spanish citizens in the UK or British citizens in Spain, you will understand that we now have a reason to talk about how the pandemic has impacted all of us and how it's going to impact in countries that are related to Spain and the UK. For the British Chamber to do our mission, we do a number of business meetings with our members and webinars. Since the confinement, since the 16th of March, we are doing all our activity online, to which some of the activities addressed to members and the rest of the activity is also open to non-members. Let me tell you that one of our strengths in a moment like today, and this is very related to how we all have to be very conscious of who are our allies politically and economically. The same for business. One of our strengths is that we belong to a network, a global network of over 100 British chambers in the world, 52 of which are in the UK. That's why sometimes it is easier for us to talk about countries that are not necessarily the UK or Spain. And this is how it happened when I read on the 12th of April a wonderful article written by Celia Maza of El Confidencial, who was interviewing Neil Melvin, one of our speakers today. And that's how it was so easy for me to get hold of Mike Rosenberg, who is one of the leading researchers in IESE, because IESE is one of our patron members and is actually one of our newly elected board of 15 businesses that has been announced today. Why the topic? Why are we talking about geopolitics? Well, we're talking about geopolitics because we think that a lot of our businesses are doing a lot of business, not only in the UK and Spain, but in a lot of complicated countries. Just to start by China, where the virus was originated. The speakers are very knowledgeable on politics, but obviously there will be moments when we will be talking about the impact of this new geopolitical map in both business and the economy. As you will not be surprised, the British Chamber talks mostly about Spain and the UK. And obviously we've been talking since 2006 a lot about how our relations will be during the negotiation of Brexit. But since Brexit and since the pandemic, we've realized that probably we should be talking more about what is happening in other countries and how can we help our companies to understand more geopolitics. I'm quoting one of the phrases in Neil Melvin's article, the pandemic has become the biggest challenge in times of peace that our generation has experienced. So we obviously can't avoid talking about this subject, especially in a moment like today, in an unprecedented crisis caused by a virus that was something that we had not known before. Now, allow me a few seconds to introduce the bios of the speakers, who are people that are prestigious in their organizations, who are people who have a lot of years of experience in the topic they're talking today. And this is why I think it's important that I read their bios and we realize how lucky we are to have the time of these two speakers. Dr. Neil Melvin is the Director of International Security Studies at the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI, in London. RUSI is a prestigious think tank on defense and security. Prior to joining RUSI, he served as political advisor, head of regional office to the European Union, special representative for the Horn of Africa. He has been director of research at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, has held senior positions at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, what we know as OSCE, and the Energy Chapter Secretariat. Neil has also held research positions at Chatham House and the Centre for European Policy Studies, as well as teaching posts at the Brussels School of International Studies, Leeds University, and the London School of Economics. He has a PhD in philosophy by the University of Oxford and has been a visiting researcher at Harvard University. Welcome, Neil. And now Mike Rosenberg is an associate professor in the Strategic Management Department at ESA Business School, where he lectures on strategy, geopolitics, and sustainability in ESA MBA's programs. Professor Rosenberg is the author of the book Strategy and Sustainability, published in 2015, which looks at the issue of environmental sustainability from the viewpoint of a firm's CEO and members of its board of directors, and Strategy and Geopolitics, published in 2017, which argues that international companies need to do a better job understanding geopolitics and managing risks. He also does consultancy for leading international companies and is asked to speak on topics relating to scenario planning, sustainability, and managing global firms in complex geopolitical situations. Mike has an undergraduate degree in naval architecture from the University of Michigan, an MBA from ESA Business School, and received his PhD from the Cranfield School of Management. And now I have the pleasure to pass the floor first to Neil, who will do a short introduction, followed by Mike, and then both of them will do for 25-30 minutes a colloquium, and then we will open the floor for questions. Neil.
For your kind introduction, Ava. It's a real privilege to be on this webinar for your members and new members, perhaps also together with Michael Rosenberg. You mentioned in your introductory comments the close relationship with Spain and the UK, and of course we've been following very closely this terrible pandemic situation in Spain, and so please allow me to express my condolences to all the people who've lost loved ones and friends during this crisis and have suffered. But also Spain has been, I think, a sign of hope, as we've seen on British TV anyway, that the young children, as they were released from lockdown in Spain, I think gave us all hope for the future. And so I think we should continue to follow what's been happening in the country as we go forward. In terms of the sort of subject matter for today, what I want to do is just in a few moments just sketch out what I see as 5 sort of larger trends that will be worth thinking about. But before that, just a few words about geopolitics, which I think some people can sound like a strange word. And I remember even a few years ago when I was talking about this with some German colleagues, it had a very negative connotation, of course, in Germany from World War II, where geopolitics was seen to be linked to the Nazi regime. But geopolitics itself is actually just a way of understanding a dimension of international politics. And it's a dimension that we haven't really paid a lot of attention to for many years because it's been rather hidden away. And that is because the international order that we all know, actually an important dimension of that is the power relations between major powers. And of course, for much of the post-World War II period, and particularly in the post-Cold War period, we've had one power, the United States, which has underpinned much of the other parts of the international system. So we've tended to talk about the rules-based order, and the rules-based order itself has different elements. There's an international security element focused on the United Nations. There's a sort of an economic system based around institutions like the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank. And then there is the Western world. And all of these overlap, but ultimately they're been underpinned by US power in various forms. And so why geopolitics has come back is, of course, because that underpinning has begun to be questioned and challenged, most notably by the rise of China, but also by countries like Russia, who've sort of pushed back against the United States. And so we began to see then a questioning also of multilateralism in general. So I would say that geopolitics and the rules-based order are all interlinked. In Europe, we've often seen them as one or the other, that Trump is bad because he does geopolitics and Europe is positive because we do the rules-based order. But in fact, they are very sort of, they're intrinsically tied together. And so this is why it's important, I think, to understand how geopolitics is changing, because rules are in many ways a tool. They're not an end in themselves. So if power relations begin to change, and we've seen that, of course, with President Trump's challenge to many of the institutions of the rules-based order, that doesn't necessarily reflect an end of those mechanisms, but it may well be that those mechanisms are beginning to adapt as power shifts. So after that brief introduction on geopolitics, what then do I see as the main sort of trends that we've seen emerging from this pandemic? Well, firstly, I would say that the pandemic has been a catalyst for change, but the geopolitics I was talking about earlier on have preceded the pandemic. So the pandemic has been mostly an accelerator of them. And the first most important change, I think, is the rise of China led many people, I think, to believe that we were heading for a sort of bipolar world of leadership by United States and China, possibly what's called a G2 rather than the old G7 we used to have. Then it was G8, then Russia dropped out or was pushed out. People were looking to the G2. Coming out of the pandemic, we're very much in the G0 world, is that neither United States or China has emerged from the pandemic with a leading role. And so what we see is increased fragmentation in the international system as a result of that. Second big sort of, it's not really a change, but I think an acceleration, is the emergence of the Indo-Pacific as the leading geographical space, both for economic power and increasingly for security questions. Much of the Cold War, of course, Europe was that area. As the confrontation took place within Europe between the Soviet Union and NATO forces, and of course the US. The rise of China, but not only China, the rise of other economies in the Indo-Pacific region have begun to shift that center of economic gravity to that region, but also now increasingly see security questions, security competition as focused on that area. I think that the pandemic is accelerating that shift. A third larger scale trend, I think, has been the focus on nations as the main actors in the international system. Again, this is not totally new. We saw going into the crisis, many organizations, multilateral organizations, have been facing enormous difficulties. The United Nations, of course, was facing a severe challenge. The EU has been a prolonged series of crises. But the pandemic has really been a nation-state-based response. There's been relatively little international cooperation, particularly in the absence of the US leadership, but also no one else has stepped into that role. And multilateralism has not been the main response. It's been individual countries. And we've seen that, of course, even in Europe, in which, at least in the first phase of the pandemic, it was countries largely on their own. We may be seeing a pickup on this, on the European response, but we can perhaps return to that issue in the question and answer session. The fourth trend, I would say, and is linked to that, of course, is the decline of multilateralism, and even a sort of a contesting of multilateralism. So in the pandemic, of course, the World Health Organization has become a political football, attacked by many, seen as highly politicized. in the pocket of China. Some people have accused it of failing to pick up on the pandemic because of that influence, of failing to have Taiwan as a member because China was blocking it because it didn't recognize it as a separate country. But I think a wider crisis that the United Nations Security Council has not been able to meet on the pandemic because of the sort of power blockages there. So we've seen that crisis in multilateralism, which we felt in Europe, but is part of a broader global trend. And the last thing I'll just sort of highlight in these brief introductory remarks is sort of the major question mark that's arisen around Europe. As I mentioned, of course, we had a series of crises over the last decade involving Europe, beginning in the financial crisis. We've had Brexit, but sort of deeper structural questions about the European project, the Eurozone, debt mutualization, all these kind of issues, the budget, which have continued to be a challenge for Europe. I would say quite a lot of disappointment around European foreign policy and security policy. In the pandemic, we've seen Europe not be a global actor, but even falling short as being a regional actor. The headlines have been dominated by Russian humanitarian aid, Chinese humanitarian aid. Turkey has been flying airplanes to the UK. So rather than this image of Europe as being a sort of a global humanitarian power, we seem to have been flipped, in which often smaller middle powers have taken that agenda and Europe hasn't been able to respond. That's not to say there hasn't been a response, but Europe hasn't been able to sell that response and make that claim that it's taking a leadership role, and indeed has often looked quite fractured. So this, I think, is one of the major questions of our discussion today is, can Europe now respond coming out of the pandemic and begin to take a new direction? So having introduced those 5 themes, I'd now like to turn to my colleague Michael and just sort of bring in more the economics aspect, but also how geoeconomics or geopolitics and geoeconomics interact, and ask Michael whether in your experience you feel that sort of geopolitics is sufficiently present in many of the business strategies of corporations, particularly bearing in mind some of these big sort of changes that I've been mapping out in my comments.
Hello, can you hear me now? Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Sorry, I had a small glitch there. I guess everyone's in Spain, or most of you are in Spain, so I'll say good afternoon. If anyone's from far, far away, let me say good morning or good evening, depending upon where you are. To answer your question, Neil, I don't think business pays any attention whatsoever to geopolitics. This is why I introduced a class in our full-time MBA program. I wrote a book on the subject, and I've been trying to kind of get the word out to some degree. And I'm very happy and very pleased that the British Chamber has organized this event, because I think it's exactly the kind of thing that such an organization should be doing. You know, in my experience, there's a world of diplomats, analysts, military officers, even spies and journalists and specialists such as yourself, who spend pretty much all of their time looking at the power politics of the world and looking at, you know, how many missiles North Korea has, or what the mix of forces are in different places, and how all of that is reflected in historical trends based upon the geography and the politics of the world. Then there's the international business community, who by and large read nothing that all of those people produce. And when I work with boards and I talk to senior executives, pretty much the state of play is to assume that the world is fine, to assume that things will go well, and to assume that business as usual will stay like that forever. And if you read history, you know that's fundamentally not true. Things happen. And I think the coronavirus is a great example of something that happened. We didn't really expect it, although the specialist had looked at it in quite a lot of depth, and people have been warning that something like this would happen for years. But we were caught by surprise when Crimea was annexed by Russia the Europe was caught by surprise. How could they do such a thing? Spanish and Irish farmers were caught in the counter sanctions and the sanctions back and forth between Russia and the EU. Russia banned agricultural products from the EU into Russia, and all of these farmers lost their biggest, most profitable market. And many of those companies, many of those food companies, and the executives in them probably didn't know where Crimea was, or had any idea that Crimea could be in play at this point in time. So this is what I mean by taking by surprise. And if you look at most of the executives, and probably most of the people in our call here today, most business leaders that I know studied economics, business, or engineering, or sometimes law. Very few of them read history in school, which leaves business leaders kind of unprepared and unknowledgeable to deal with these kinds of things. In our full-time MBA, for example, I have students from 60 different countries, and each one knows their own history pretty well. But the Chinese know nothing about India. The Indians know nothing about the formation of countries in Africa. The Africans know a little bit about the world, but they don't even know, if they're from West Africa, they don't know the history of East Africa very well. So one of the things I tried to do in the MBA is to try to get everybody to understand where everybody is coming from, so that they can actually understand the news and understand what's happening. Now, I think, Neil, you did a great job kind of elucidating the 5 trends you see affecting the world even before this crisis. And the only thing I would add to them is this absence of American leadership. And many people blame President Trump for that. And I am a fierce critic of the president. If you read anything I write or listen to me in any speech, I vote Democratic, and I think the guy is a terrible, terrible, terrible president. However, in this issue of American leadership, Trump is a symptom, not the cause. If you look back over time, the United States engages with the world and pulls back. It engages again with the world and pulls back again. And Trump just had the good fortune to be in the right place at the right time. In fact, to some degree, Senator Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are similar in that they want to kind of get out of the world and focus on American problems. I think this absence of American leadership, the stepping down from where it has been for 70 years, is a huge problem for the world. And in this crisis, I think we've seen it very, very, very clearly. We've seen it even in the deployment of American power. The American Navy fired one of its captains because he wanted to take the sailors off the ship during an outbreak on his aircraft carrier, and then it was fired. Now they may be bringing him back in. This is just showing the world that the United States is not really there at this moment of critical time. Neil, what do you see as the impact of the virus on these 5 trends? Do you think it's going to turn everything upside down, or just accelerate the trends that have already been in play?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mean, I think that some people have seen this pandemic as kind of a world-changing moment, and I think obviously it is a major challenge, as I noted in those comments that Ava read at the beginning. But I think it's more in this catalytic mode than itself being a driver of changes. And I think what we're seeing is a rebalancing and, as I mentioned before, an acceleration. And I agree with you what you said about the United States, is that President Trump is obviously a particular brand, extreme brand in the United States. But if you look across a whole range of different factors, the USA is undergoing major change. Part of it is demographic. The European component of US is gradually being supplemented by immigrants from Latin America, from Asia. And so the country is, I think, looking less to Europe than it used to as a sort of a reference point for things like culture. And you see that in the way that the curricula in universities has changed away from Western civilizations, it used to be called, to other sort of broader global subjects. But also, I mean, the reality is that the US interests are changing. I mean, Europe is not the major fulcrum of global security, and there's not a systematic challenge to the US in Europe. Russia is a problem. It's a regional problem, but it doesn't represent a systemic competitor. The Soviet Union did. So while the US, I think, remains heavily engaged in Europe, and you can see that in the area I follow very closely on security, is despite all of President Trump's pronouncements about European defense spending, the US has now almost, the highest number of troops and deployed in Europe, and spending a lot of money on NATO. But of course, China is the real challenge, and so of course it's shifting away. One other sort of issue I think may change before I perhaps hand back to you is the issue of middle powers, because one of the big changes I think that we were seeing as we went into this pandemic was beneath the United States and China, a whole bunch of middle powers, and I would say this includes Russia, Turkey, India, Gulf states, were starting to take on stronger roles themselves. As the US began to pull back from some of its areas, that they were moving in to fill that vacuum and becoming important regional actors. These are the countries that are very leveraged economically now, either because they've had to borrow extensively or because they're hydrocarbon-based economies. And of course, we've seen that the oil prices just tanked. So there's a question about whether some of these countries are going to carry on playing the role that they were sort of a year ago, particularly over the last 5 years, as we exit from this crisis. Back to you, Mike.
Well, and let me just ask you a question about that, because the price of oil has not only tanked, it's just collapsed. I mean, at point, I think last time I checked, Brent, one of the crude oil indices was at $20. West Texas Intermediate, I think, was even lower than that. At even one point a couple of weeks ago, people with futures contracts were paying people to take their oil. So oil had a negative effective price. And of course, the Russians say they have enough cash to last for a number of years. The Saudi budget is based on oil. The Venezuelan economy is completely gone. Do you see, is oil and the collapse of the price of oil, is that going to be catalytic, as you would say? Is that going to be a detonator for even more profound change, I don't know, in the Middle East or in other parts of the world?
I mean, my own interpretation is it's going to be a highly differentiated situation. Some countries, particularly some of the developing countries, which are A, highly reliant on oil, and B, have very little in the way of reserves. And I think of Venezuela, I think of Nigeria. These kind of countries face a sort of a catastrophic situation. Angola, possibly, I mean, Mozambique is coming on stream, but still has some income.
Reserves, you mean cash reserves, not oil reserves. Yes. They have oil on the ground. They don't have any money.
They've got very little sort of buffer, and I mean, their budgets are highly reliant on that. Other countries are going to have a difficult time, but may be able to weather it. I mean, I think Russia would be in that category. They obviously they had a substantial sort of wealth fund they built up, but they're going to run through that. But of course, President Putin has he's got some big commitments. I mean, there's the cost of all these military adventures in Syria, in Libya, in Ukraine. He was quite unpopular he was always losing popularity going into the pandemic. They haven't handled it very well. So it might be a factor within this that there's going to be greater austerity, which may lose support. And then, of course, the big question is the Middle East, where, again, I mean, some countries may be better placed. The Saudis obviously got quite substantial resources, but it is going to limit them. And I mean, and they have this longer-term problem of the decline of the oil-based economies in many parts of the globe, particularly in Europe and to some degree in North America. So what we may see is an acceleration of their shift to Asia. I mean, we've seen that the global energy markets are increasingly shifting to the Asian ones. That's where the growing demand is going to be for oil and gas and even coal, and less and less demand for those kind of things on Europe and North America. And that, of course, may have political repercussions, since the West has been a big supporter of the Gulf countries in large part because of that strategic oil supply.
If I understand it, that now 80% of the oil leaving the Persian Gulf is going east. then you wonder whether the Americans really need to keep the Sixth Fleet in Bahrain, or if they're going to pull it out someday because it costs a lot of money to keep it there. And if they did pull out the fleet from Bahrain, would Iran and Saudi Arabia go to war? But all of that is speculation. One of the things I see in this crisis is really a choice, and I think it was very well summed up by Noah Yuval Harari in a FT piece a couple of weeks ago, where he wrote about the world coming to a choice about building more walls and more surveillance to keep people safe, or working closer together. And one of the things we've seen is basically the nation state, as you said earlier, kind of replacing the European Union, or replacing things, and people kind of saying we have to keep our people safe, our country, our nation, at the cost of globalization. Now, I'm typically an optimist, so the other thing I see is people working together in so many different places. I know people who have stopped their major production units to build, to assemble ventilators. Companies which, instead of making clothing, is making masks, and just this outpouring of solidarity in the face of the crisis. So I'm relatively hopeful that that push towards greater solidarity will eventually percolate up into governments, and eventually, put things back in the other direction on the pendulum. But I'm not sure if that's the case. And if you look at Europe, as you said earlier, the response was just dismal. The European response to Italy first, and then to Spain, and then closing the borders country by country, then every country kind of doing their own thing in terms of opening them or reopening or not opening. And how do you, as an Englishman, I guess, how do you see the European response? Is it as dismal as I see it with my American eyes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has been very disappointing. I mean, it's in terms of I mean, in a way, we didn't even need to have the European Union to have a solidarity. But of course, with the European Union, you'd expected even more. I mean, we've seen in many parts of the world that neighbors have actually taken initiatives towards their neighbors. Even the Gulf countries have been sending assistance to the Iranians. But inside Europe, it took actually a kind of embarrassment, because others were starting to do it, for us to even do the basic level of cooperation. I mean, now that has picked up, of course. We've seen some very important gestures from countries like Germany and others towards their neighbors. But it seems somehow that we were left waiting. I mean, perhaps it's because we thought things would happen at the European level and people were waiting for that they didn't take the initiatives at the national level. Now we're starting to see a bigger discussion emerging. Some very difficult questions are on the table. I mean, I think many of them are for you to perhaps respond to, Mike, about the economics of integration. We've seen a lot of discussion about debt mutualization, so-called Eurobonds, about whether the ECB can be the way forward, about vast amounts of money being put on the table for moving out of the pandemic. I mean, do you see that these initiatives are realistic? I mean, are they the right initiatives, do you think? Can they succeed?
Well, Neil, I mean, as the governor of New York said, we have a health crisis, and then the measures to contain the health crisis, to flatten the curve, as I'm sure all of you know about, have produced the economic crisis. Now, Governor Cuomo said, okay, first we're going to handle the health crisis, and my daughter lives in New York City, so I'm glad they're doing that. And then they're going to attack the economic crisis. And really the economic question that my colleagues in the faculty who are economics, they're debating all the time, is will this shock be a V, in the sense that, okay, we've had a complete stoppage of the global economy, and then will it just bounce back up? Or will it be more like an L, and it's going to drop, and then it's going to take a long time to recover? Like here in Spain, in 2009, we had a drop, and it took us 5 or 6 years to kind of get back to somewhere close to where the country was before. Governments around the world, what they're doing is pouring money into it and trying to hit that V, trying to get it to bounce back. The American government's pouring money. The European ministers agreed 540 billion of extra spending to do that. What they have not agreed about yet, as far as I can tell, is Eurobonds. Eurobonds is the idea that Spain could borrow money, which is then backed up by the other 19. Basically, Spain would be like Germany and pay the same interest as Germany. And if there's any kind of risk of default, Europe would pay the bonds. This is political dynamite in Germany and Holland and some of the other northern countries. But at the same time, the southern countries are saying, but hey, if we're all together and this is a crisis, this is the time to show it. So I don't see a resolution on the euro bond situation anytime soon. And I think what the European finance ministers agreed is, okay, let's agree to throw a bunch of money and hope that people don't keep asking for bonds. That's just a more complicated question. Will it be enough money? And you mentioned the situation here in Spain and how hopeful it is to see children. So we were actually allowed to go for a walk yesterday for the first time. And I live in a town not so far from Barcelona on the sea. And I've got to tell you, the joy of seeing people walk in the streets and the joy that they seem to feel just cycling and walking and roller skating and a couple holding hands or parents with their kids, all of this gives me a tremendous sense of hope that people want to be in the world. People want to go out to dinner. People want to go to the movies, for God's sakes. And as long as the health authorities can figure out some way that makes us think we're going to be safe, I'm not saying we're going to be safe, but we're going to think we're going to be safe, I'm quite optimistic that things can bounce back. I remember after 9/11, I was at the Geneva Auto Show when the World Trade Center was knocked down, and airlines were grounded, and we're never going to fly again. And very quickly we got used to taking off our shoes and having some more checks and having some more uniformed people at the airports, and boom, people went back to business as usual. So I'm a little bit optimistic, but the economic news, of course, is terrible. I mean, if I look at my computer behind you, I can see the IMF forecast for April, just a couple of weeks ago, with Spanish economy decreasing by 7%, the German economy decreasing, or Spanish 8%, Germany decreasing by 7%, Italy decreasing by 9%. So this is going to be serious economic pain if these forecasts are true, and if we don't bounce back relatively quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that worries me a little bit in the conversation is it's very much about and how much and who pays. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of sort of focus on what the money is actually going to do. Are we going to invest in innovation? Are we going to invest in new technologies? What are we going to do with it? And so it seems a lot of kind of horse trading. And of course, this may be one of the weaknesses of the European model. It's often building the consensus is more important than necessarily doing the right policy. But
speaking of Europe, is England ever going to leave? I mean, is this going to affect the? I mean, I guess England's out, but now there's some negotiations going on. Boris got sick, so that probably set things back, and they've got to make a deal or ask for another extension. What is the state of play of the so-called Brexit-ternity, as my colleague Nuria Mas calls it?
Thank you very much. I always love to talk about the Brexit question, so I appreciate.
Sorry about that.
But perhaps you can make this last one. I'm going to hand back to Eva, because I'm sure that some of the people watching would have lots of questions or comments. But no, I mean, obviously, we're always at a critical moment with Brexit, but we seem to be at another one here in which the time clock is now ticking. The pandemic is, of course, taking up a lot of bandwidth in terms of the government's focus on this. I think that there is a question from outsiders whether the current UK government is using the threat of no deal as a negotiating tactic, or whether it's actually really prepared to do this. And of course, there are some arguments on both sides. I mean, of course, the argument on the side of the negotiating tactic are that the European Union is, of course, has the strongest hand in this. It's the Goliath to the UK's David in this negotiation, and so it has to play a sort of UK has to use brinkmanship. And of course, no one would think that you'd want to have an economic shock on top of the pandemic. On the other hand, I think the arguments against it are that the European Union is being pretty inflexible on two key red line areas for the UK. One is on fisheries, and one is on this so-called dynamic alignment, which is the idea that not only should the UK sort of enforce EU standards as they apply today, but the UK should align with them going forward, sort of in perpetuity. Both those issues seem very tough ones for the Conservative government to agree to, because I think they feel that for Brexit to work, they need the flexibility, particularly around standards, to sort of focus on what the UK can do. If it doesn't have a large market, then it has to be based on innovation, competitiveness, being quick, and sort of aligning with EU standards won't help it do that. And I think the pandemic may have played into it, the second agenda, because I mean, now the Conservative Party is in a position that a Labour government would have dreamt of. I mean, they're pouring money into the economy, they're borrowing, they're centralising sort of instruments of power. So, of course, all these are the sorts of tools that will be much easier to handle a no deal going forward, because you'll be able to cushion to some degree the economic shock. You'll have a more strategic response in terms of capacities. And I mean, the population may well be sort of used to this crisis mode that we're in at the moment. So I think we're going to see, I mean, the crunch time is coming up on, I mean, at that point, there's going to be I think there'll be one moment after that, if they agree to go into a sort of an alternative negotiation. Otherwise, we may well be heading for the no deal scenario. So on that cheerful note, I'll hand back to Eva.
Why are you giving me the most difficult one? Well, it's true that Brexit is going to be probably a question that will come up. And if it doesn't come up, I definitely being a bilateral association that represents both British and Spanish businesses in the majority, we really want to know what is happening, although obviously you will not have the answer. We have the same suspicion. We have the suspicion that depending on how the pandemic is hitting the economic crisis in the UK, the UK may feel that it's going to be much easier to handle the situation with a bit more freedom. So the no deal or a quicker negotiation to have a basic agreement seems to us to be the most likely scenario. I don't know whether we've got any colleagues from the British Embassy today with more knowledge than me, because my knowledge is mainly based on what we are reading in the press and what we are hearing from the British correspondents and the Spanish correspondents in the UK. I don't know whether you guys want to continue a little bit more, because China, the US, Africa, and Russia may not have been in the whole depth that you want. If not, we can open the floor and ask if there are any questions. Shall we?
Why don't you go ahead and ask for questions? I mean, the only thing that I did want to point out, because Neil, you asked me while we were preparing for this, the impact on the American election. And the jury is still out. I mean, President Trump and his son-in-law, Mr. Kirshner, are trying to tell the world what a wonderful job he's done during the crisis. But at the same time, he's on television. He told people that maybe they should be ingesting or injecting bleach into their system. Just saying absolutely crazy things, and he doesn't listen to experts. And I don't know if it's a projection or a hope that the American people turn to Senator Biden, who, okay, he's in his 70s, but he's a serious man. He won't say silly things, and he'll just provide that kind of presidential leadership that this guy has not been able to do. But I don't know. I mean, I wrote 8 blog posts about the last election explaining why Trump could never win. So I'm not probably the best person to answer that question. But Eva, do you have any questions? I mean, the two of us can keep talking all day, but I think we should be more responsive to your audience than just to each other.
You could be talking all day and we would be delighted listening to you all day. I haven't received any questions through the chat, and I'll start with one, and then I'll try to beg that people participate, because some of the people that we've got listening today represent businesses that are present in many countries. And one of the businesses is actually in the automotive sector, which I know, Mike, you have some experience. And it's probably, Spain is fairly important in the manufacturing of car components, both in Spain and in the UK, and in a lot of the countries that are now affected by the pandemic. But going to my first question, talking about this geopolitical map, if you think of the UK as an economy and as in its own history, and you think of Spain, the two countries are very different. When we've expanded our economies, we've been looking at different parts of the world. I remember being very young, studying in the UK and seeing how, you know, just watching the news in the UK, the part of the international news was much larger, and they were talking about countries I'd never heard of, the Middle East and the Far East as much. While when I was in Spain, maybe some of the large corporations in very strong sectors like the tourism industry obviously started their international growth in the north of Africa or in Latin America. So history and economy and politics are very often going together. So while we allow time for people to make questions, can you help us to understand which are going to be the allies in the current situation of the pandemic for the UK and Spain, and the differences that we've got with our history and our politics?
Shall I go
You want to start with the UK, or you want me to talk about Spain?
I can say some words about the UK, as I know that best. I mean, of course, you're right. Of course, history is a very important factor, and of course, Britain with its, particularly in the 19th century, early 20th century, with its sort of global imperial system. I mean, there's important legacy relations for that. But I would say that perhaps more important is going to be what happens in the next couple of years, because in the post-Cold War, sort of in the post-World War II and post-Cold War period, I mean, the UK has positioned itself really at the heart of the Western Alliance, the transatlantic system. So it's had its foot both in the US and the European camps. With the changes in the US, but also, and then with Brexit. But I would say Brexit is not just the sort of the UK's departure, but I think it's these wider challenges facing Europe. I mean, it's not simply that Europe itself is a static thing. I mean, it's those issues are also in motion, and we don't really know how the European Union is going to evolve, and whether it's going to have further crises or whether it's going to sort of emerge triumphant. But so the UK has this question, I think, a big one, which we are debating at my institute quite a lot, is where are the UK's national interests now? And these negotiations are, the Brexit negotiations, the US negotiations, which are just starting about a trade deal, but also the bigger question about whether actually the future lies not in Europe, but in Indo-Pacific, means that the UK itself needs to think much more about markets and security of the Indo-Pacific. And by that, I don't just mean China. I'm talking about Indonesia, Vietnam, of course, India, East African markets, the Gulf countries, Australia. I mean, this is where the dynamism, the global dynamism is. And if Brexit goes wrong in terms of the UK not getting a deal, then it may, of course, feel that that's where the opportunities lie, and that's where its efforts may go. And I mean, what I am concerned about is that may have also implications for security, because the UK has been a major security guarantor of Europe. Along with the US, it's been the largest sort of investor in European security. But if it feels it has to start moving its resources to other places, then there will be a crunch. I mean, it won't be possible to have the same commitment with Europe. And of course, the EU, like these other things I've been talking about, is not just a rules-based order, it's also a geopolitical order. And it worked so effectively because we had Britain, France, and Germany aligned underneath it. Now we have Europe's three biggest military powers, Russia, Turkey, and the UK, outside it. So the security doesn't align with the sort of the economic and political frameworks. So I think, I mean, this is what we need to think about in the Brexit negotiation. It's not just a question of fish. There's some pretty big other issues, and I think they sometimes get forgotten in the rather sort of micro negotiation issues that we've been looking at.
In terms of Spain, I think fish is clearly important to Spain. I think Spain still has the largest fishing fleet in the world. But as you talk about a possible watering down of the EU, Spain may just solidify its look towards Latin America on the one hand, and Morocco and the Magreb on the other. But in any case, Spain is going to be out of the the bigger story. I mean, there is a reasonable relationship with China, there's a reasonable relationship with Japan, but all those markets are, and all those people are far away. Spain is not the center of gravity of any of that. think we have many people on the call today who work for large Spanish companies who, a generation ago, as they needed to go abroad, they all went to Latin America for a couple of reasons. One, for cultural and language issues, but also for, that the competitors in Europe were really big. So it was easier perhaps to go there. I'm heartened by King Felipe and his relationship with Mohammed VI in Morocco. But I think Spain, geopolitically is going to be in the corner. Its NATO membership is important to it. It's connected to Europe that way, but it's not going to be, the center of action or the center of gravity by any means. This is reality. If tourism does come back, then I think things will be fine, but that might take a while. If I could, Ava, just on the issue of the automotive industry, it's been really, really hard hit. My dean and I have been having some roundtable discussions with CEOs of different companies, and the guys in the automotive sector have been devastated. I mean, the car sales have just stopped in most parts of the world, which means the factories have stopped. In some cases, the factories had to stop because of the virus. Wuhan, for example, is a center for electric cars and battery production in China. Now, I'm told that the Chinese factories are back up at 80, 90%, maybe 70% in some cases, so that there is this possibility of a V-shaped response. But it's really too early to tell to see if people start buying new cars again. And if people don't buy new cars, the automotive industry is very much related to GDP. People buy cars when they're feeling wealthy. Your old car will last for another 6 months or a year, always. And this is really the challenge. I think the other challenge for people in those businesses, especially people in many, many countries with operations all over the world, is some parts of the world are shut down, some parts of the world are opening up, some parts of the world may shut down in the future. We haven't talked about Africa yet and what can happen there. So as you look around the world and as you try to manage a global business in this kind of rolling blackout that we're seeing from COVID-19, this becomes very, very difficult.
This is fascinating because, as you know, some of the large Spanish manufacturers are, present in the UK and in other countries. And because I know that you've been working in that industry, I was very curious to know your views. It's been quite sad to have to accept that Spain is not going to be the center of gravity. Not that we didn't know that, which we all know, but it's sad to see that probably, we've lost some opportunities to play a better role in Europe and in a wider global perspective. Anyway, we've got a few questions, which I appreciate from people. I'll be introducing, the first one is coming from Richard Grant, who works at Nueva Pesca Nova. Richard, thank you very much for the question. And his question is, will geopolitics be changed by limited travel in the future? What may be the new partnerships that emerge? For any of you.
So shall I have a go at that?
Sure. I've got a view about travel, but you go ahead.
Yeah, I think not to sort of beat the drum too much again on this theme, but what we were beginning to see was a sort of fragmentation, a political fragmentation of the world. I mean, although we talked about globalization, we were seeing sort of key sub-regions built around these middle powers beginning to emerge. And of course, I think we're all familiar with the travel dimension of that. It started some years ago with countries like Turkish Airlines, Qatar, Emirates, the Asian airlines. So I mean, what we've seen, and we've seen this in the pandemic, is often they've sort of carried on functioning as regional systems. I mean, I think for me, one of the questions is the degree to which we're going to see, a stronger regionalization of the world, and travel will be a part of that with these travel hubs, which are sort of magnifying local and sort of middle powers. I mean, because it used to be, of course, US and Europe. I mean, these were the global airlines. Gradually, we've ceded all of that. So I think that, that's one issue around travel. I mean, I think it's very interesting the degree to which, in general, we're going to go back to the business models that we had before the pandemic. I mean, my organization has been putting off doing this kind of call for many years. Now, suddenly, within 2 weeks, we've all had to learn how to do Zoom and WebEx and whatever it is. despite lots of resistance. So we've gone over a hurdle. And we're now, I think, I mean, at least we're all thinking about when we come out of this, it's not going to be going back to the business as normal. Things are going to be done differently. And maybe that's a good thing, particularly, I think, where that intersects with the climate change agenda. So, I mean, there may well be less travel, and that may well sort of strengthen regional identities, regional markets, kind of regional political frameworks as those sort of global links begin to become less significant. And also, I mean, one of the biggest, I think, questions coming out of this is going to be what in Britain we call decoupling, in the sense that our economies have become too reliant, particularly on China, for strategic areas. So this sort of personal protective equipment is one, medicines is another. The whole just-in-time delivery system, of course, has begun to break down. And so, you know, is that really, looking ahead, is that really, are we going to be able to rely on that, particularly when we don't, you know, the trust with China has been quite badly harmed. But then what does that mean? Does that mean pulling back everything to our individual countries? That seems unlikely. So then it means diversification, which of course, you know, that again is likely, I think, just to strengthen Indo-Pacific, because people will be looking instead of China to Vietnam or Thailand or Cambodia, whatever the sort of the latest economy is. So I think that may well strengthen those areas rather than necessarily help us in Europe. I mean, I think we really need in Europe to start thinking in new and creative ways. I saw someone had a question about what should the EU do. You know, I think we've now reached a point where we have to have a discussion about what should Europe do, because, you know, we've got many different kinds of Europe now. The idea that the EU was going to be the whole of Europe, not just with, you know, Brexit, but I think that, you know, there's bigger challenges now which are not necessarily going to mean the EU is the main framework, and perhaps the EU has not been able to respond in some areas in the way that we think about it. And obviously I know foreign and security policy best, and it's been, despite I know we have a Spanish senior politicians leading that area now, but I mean, we don't really have a strategic European foreign and security policy that is dealing with these issues, these global issues. And I'm not sure that can be, we've been trying to make it for over a decade and it doesn't. So maybe we need to start thinking in other ways. Perhaps I'll hand back to Mike on that point.
Yeah, just real briefly, I mean, I think the pandemic and our forced digitalization has created some people to rethink some ideas. I've got in a program we run for Irish CEOs, two of the participants said they're never traveling again. They think they can do everything virtually, but I just don't believe it. You know, in my experience, you can maintain a relationship online and virtually, but it's difficult to create it. I think humans still need to shake each other's hands and look each other's in the eyes and share a meal together. And I think that's going to be true forever. Now, maybe it is going to be less and you're going to be more selective, but I think business will still travel. But of course, business travel subsidizes the planes. So if business travel drops a little bit, it changes the nature of airline distribution a lot. In terms of just in time and in terms of the globalization of supply chains, there's a whole very interesting topic. Probably what will happen is most people will start to look at resilience as well as the lowest cost supply chain and try to find a better balance. For the last 30 years, again, as I said earlier, you know, it's been everything's going to be fine. We can assume that the world is going to be running perfectly, and therefore we can have a very, very lean, very, very low cost global supply chain with very, very little or no safety stock in the entire system. We saw that with Fukushima. We saw that with the tsunami, and now we've seen it with the virus. That's just not good enough. Schneider Electric is a large French company. They have two sources of supply for everything they buy in different parts of the world. They do that deliberately. It costs them money, but they have a policy that if we're sourcing 80% of something from China, we need a smaller provider somewhere in Europe just in case. And I think that will be bringing resilience into the question. But that, in my view, Eva, has to come from the board. The supply chain manager will not propose solutions which cost a lot of money because they'll lose their job. But if the board of directors says, hey, we don't want this to happen again, hedge our bets, how much is it going to cost us? They can fix that. So it's a question, there's a question of governance in there and behavior. The last thing on the airlines, I do believe that and I'm not a virologist or a biologist, but just like 9/11, someone will come up with some relatively quick and fast test where you put your finger on a thing, it hurts a little bit, the light turns green and you get on the plane, the light turns yellow and you go stand over there, the light turns red, but they send you home. I mean, I think there'll be something in place relatively quickly to give the public the feeling that they're safe so the world can get back to normal. I think the interests in making that happen are just too great. And I'm told that the scientific collaboration around the world between scientists studying this thing has been extraordinary. That while the nation states are rising again and border controls and politicians are thumping things, the scientists have actually been working, in a brilliantly collaborative way all around the world. So I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful that something good will come out of that.
Thank you very much. Let me just go through some of the questions which you have partially replied. There is a question from Derek Doyle, ex-British consul in Bilbao, good colleague of mine. It's nice to see you, Derek. He's asking about this, the risk of that we come out of the pandemic with trade protectionism. I think you've tackled on this. I was very interested, and you've already replied, that you mentioned how probably we don't have to, there has to be a decrease of this globalization and probably be less reliant on sourcing from large manufacturing places in the world like China. I don't know whether you want to add anything about that. If you allow me to continue.
Well, Eva, one thing is protection. One thing is I don't choose to buy so much from China. I want to develop new sources. Another thing is I'm going to erect Trumpian style tariffs and trade barriers, and that is an option for the world. I think it's the wrong option. It'll destroy global wealth, but it is populist politicians, when people are afraid, take advantage of that.
But do we see a chance of protectionism? You guys see a real chance of it?
I mean, I'll just come back on this resilience issue, which may play into that. I mean, I think you should also, we have to bear in mind that I think security is going to be another driver of this process. I mean, in the UK, we're just in the middle of what's a security and defence review, integrated review it's called, and the pandemic is playing directly into that. And of course, now the government, I think, is going to think seriously about whether it needs to stockpile some national resources, or whether it needs to have certain national capabilities, for example, to produce, medicines in the UK and not. So I think it's not just going to be a business decision. There's going to be a sort of a government industrial security strategy that will affect some sectors, and there probably will be a requirement for them to have these sort of capabilities actually in place. On the trade thing, I mean, I think this plays into the wider question about the relationship to China, which I think, as I saw, some of your questions have been about that. And again, speaking from a UK perspective, I mean, we are, I think, about to enter an extremely intense discussion about China. I mean, it was coming before the crisis. China's activities in the crisis, first of all, covering up the crisis, then sort of doing this rather provocative humanitarian actions, as many people have seen. And now we've had a very kind of undiplomatic action by many Chinese diplomats where they pushed back very hard against the West, and basically sort of even been spreading conspiracy theories that the whole thing began in the American military laboratory and was transferred to China. So now we see the US, and I would say the UK, and I think others are starting to discuss China not just as an opportunity and not just as a competitor, but actually as a clear threat in some areas. And so while the discussion is still going to be, I think, about the balance of those, threat, opportunity, and competitor, we are going to see a hard pushback on possibly in the UK, a revision of this decision to allow the Chinese telecoms company Huawei to have 35% of the infrastructure. I wouldn't be surprised if that is reduced. because the Conservative Party is now, I think, shifting on the China question and other areas. A lot of sort of examination of actually what is the scope of China's influence in the UK and our sort of reliance on Chinese investment. What are the Chinese learning from the UK in terms of universities, industrial technology? So I think that's going to be a very big one. And that may, of course, lead to the UK and others becoming part of this sort of Trump trade hardening agenda.
If you allow me to go to the rest of the questions, there is one about the EU. What are the changes that the EU should implement in order to play a relevant role in the world? And this is from Guillermo from the Consultancy Company Rsm Spain. There is also one about what should Spain and the UK be concerned about regarding the ambitions of China and the possible new world order. And the last one from Mark Sanderson from the organization that promotes investment towards Malaga. He's asking whether once we've got this vaccine, what is stopping the economies from returning to normal? The three questions are quite large, so we've got a few more minutes to go on.
If you like, I'll look at the what's to stop people from going back to normal. I mean, this is the question I think most business leaders are struggling with right now, Eva, which is, you know, everybody's been dealing with the now, with reacting to the crisis, and many business leaders are now getting ready to come back to life. You know, how do we start things up again? What's the order? What's the sequence? What do we do first, etc. The deeper question is really what changes will be there over time. Will people be online? Will video conferencing be part of our reality? Will people go back to restaurants and back to movie theaters? And my guess is that there are some sectors which might have fundamental change, cinemas, and others which probably won't have too much fundamental change. But this is I think what people are really struggling with. And then connected to that is this whole issue of surveillance and surveillance capitalism, as Susanna Zuboff calls it, which is, you know, we've given so much control of our lives to the people who make our telephones, to Google and to Facebook, and they have such tremendous power. You know, in China, one of the ways they stop the virus is by giving people, you know, color codes based upon where they've been and who they talk to, which is a complete, you know, submission of any kind of privacy. And really the question is, will this whole thing accelerate that tendency, which then if you look at the Chinese model compared to the Western model, you know, the Chinese government is surveilling its citizens, but in the West, we're allowing a bunch of companies in California to do it just because they give us cool toys to play with, you know, and in the end, you know, are we really, you know, pushing ourselves in a direction which nobody really wants to go? And that I think is a deeper issue. It's more long term. But I think that's something that we might start struggling with as we come out of this thing.
Do you agree, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, perhaps I could also return to this sort of this China issue, I think, which is going to be. I mean, China is going to exit the. I think part of the question is going to be the exit velocity of economies. Now, we're going to have this, I think, a very unusual situation in which China is likely to exit the sort of crisis first. So its economy is going to emerge stronger first. Normally, we used to have the US led us out of recessions and dragged the rest of the world economy behind us. Now it looks like the US may be sort of the last one because of the way the pandemic has. Now that could, of course, reshape economics. So, whether we have a way of inoculating or not, I don't know. But I think that could be a kind of juggernaut that potentially could have quite a dramatic impact on shaping things, because things like it may make the Chinese currency more attractive. I mean, the dollar may begin to lag, and that, of course, has been another one of these sort of underpinnings of the geopolitical order is the US dominance through its dollar. But I think we need to. I think this is a discussion that's coming in Europe now. I mean, and I think just a couple of days ago, Joseph Borrell, the European Union High Representative, made some interesting comments. You know, the former Spanish Foreign Minister on this, that he said he had the feeling that perhaps we've been a bit naive in Europe about China as an actor, and I think that's broadly right. But there is a kind of counter action now in which we're perhaps overcompensating and seeing China as this monolithic global actor working sort of to a single script. And I think the picture is much more complicated. We need to understand a bit more. China, of course, will, I mean, it's the second largest economy without much doubt in the world. So it will become a more important actor. And it's not going to be realistic to try and stop China emerging in some areas in that way. But then, of course, I think we need to think of what are the actual threats that China represents, and what are the areas where there may be chance to cooperate, and that may even sort of diminish the threat. So we need to have a sophisticated discussion. It's not a naive discussion. China obviously is a threat in some areas, and there are people in China who have these ambitions to sort of expand at the expense of others, despite this win-win agenda. But China also has some serious vulnerabilities. It may be that the Chinese economy is going to have its own problems. I mean, it's aging very fast. I mean, there's always this question, will China get rich before it gets old? Well, it seems no, it's going to get old before it gets rich. I mean, it doesn't seem like they're going to make that shift in time. And so they're going to have an aging population with a relatively sort of lower per capita wealth than the most developed economies. And there are some technologies where that we have to be concerned about Chinese domination. But this is also our fault. I mean, the reason the Chinese are so dominant in 5G is because there hasn't really been a Western alternative. So we need to be more strategic in answering Chinese economic statecraft. So I think the pandemic is a wake-up call for the question of China. And we need to now have a sort of grown-up conversation, and including with the Chinese, about what is the new relationship, because obviously some things do need to change.
On this issue of China, if I'd be a little bit, Neil, I'd be a little bit more provocative, and I'll quote Niall Ferguson, the English historian, who I think is at Stanford now. He says we're in Cold War 2.0 already. And in his point of view, China has built these companies up by breaking the rules. Huawei is strong because you basically you could buy a telephone system from Huawei. The Chinese Development Bank would lend you the money, and they had unfair competition against the European and American companies, which built the same technology. Ferguson sees things very, very clearly that this is going to be a long-term fight, and that it's going to have to be fought. Graham Allison at the Kennedy School talks about the rise of ever since Sparta went to war with Athens, that when a new power comes up, is war inevitable with the old power, and questions if China and the U.S. are destined for war, and this is an important issue, and I would urge everybody to read up on it and to make up their own mind. I don't think there's an answer. There's an easy answer, but the Chinese are playing a very, very long-term game. Mr. Xi has made himself premier for life, or for as long as he wants to play. He is determined to annex Taiwan. He is determined to impose Chinese control over the South China Sea. And he is determined to build his One Belt, One Road initiative. Lord knows where he's going to find the money, but basically as a way of linking economies around the world to China and not to the West. I think some of the estimates of Chinese investment in Africa is overblown, but they are spending money, lending money, doing deals with countries. They do not ask about your human rights record. They do not seem to care as long as you can back up the loans with commodities. And this is part of the geopolitical reality we have right now. China plays by her own rules, not by the West's rules. And I think this is a critical issue to look at. And in business, when you're doing business and looking for contracts in China, I'm sure many of your audience knows, intellectual property protection is a different thing. Enforcement of government regulations is complicated. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we kind of take for granted if we're doing business in France, Italy, and Germany, which are very, very different in China. So then the question is what to do about that, because you might need the contracts. These are the kinds of things which I think are going to define the future for many of the people listening and many people in the world in the next 10 or 20 years, which is why, I believe business leaders should pay more attention to people like Neil and listen to what they have to say, because they actually have insight into this kind of stuff. And most business leaders, in my experience, simply don't spend, the hour and a half we're going to spend today. They just believe that everything's going to go back to normal, and it probably won't.
Neil, is RUSI really being consulted by large corporations? Are you guys really having a chance to demonstrate that a bit of geopolitical knowledge is at the moment more important than ever?
No, I mean, historically we've been tied very much to the government, but in recent years we've had more and more business members of the organization, actually, because of, often we've had the sort of the oil and gas companies, because I think they throughout their history have operated in a kind of geopolitical context, so they've been sensitive to that. But in recent years we've had a whole range of other companies becoming more interested in, say particularly at the moment, technology companies are in active dialogue with us about the China question, because they of course feel this, both in terms of the competition, but they also feel that the reputation of technology companies can be damaged by some of the way that China is developing tech. For example, this facial recognition and the sort of supervision of large populations, the scanning of large populations using these kind of big data. So some of the Western data companies are very keen that there is a sort of Western standard that also incorporates issues of privacy and human rights, and that the Chinese are not able to dominate these sectors. So we're seeing a kind of say particularly around these questions of what we're calling economic statecraft, i.e. when states are working closely with economic actors to shape markets, but also to shape politics. And this is not, this is not what the West has been doing so effectively in recent years. We tend to provide these global goods, to try to sort of promote open markets and sort of free lanes of communication and do the security. But others are doing the business in those environments in various ways. I think, as Michael said, or China and Africa, but not just China. The Gulf countries are also doing a lot of work and building infrastructure and so on. But the Europeans and the North Americans have not been so effectively at sort of capitalizing on those markets. I think I see, having just been in East Africa for a few years before I moved back to London, you could see that the West was investing a lot of money in trying to stabilize Somalia, but Turkey ran the ports, Turkey did all the business there. The UAE ran other ports in Somaliland. So, the Chinese were building ports, but there was no sort of European business advantage from this. So there's a sort of a gap between what we're doing internationally and actually the economic benefits. I think we have to narrow that and try and tie the two more closer together.
I think if I could add, I think that's really the, besides the bad policies and the silly tweets and comments, I think the real damage that the Trump administration is doing is to this 70-year-old world order based on rules, based on institutions, and based upon, a whole bunch of things which have come all the way since the 1940s. And by going back to this kind of quid pro quo, you do this for me, I'll do that for you, et cetera, undermining that idea, the basic idea with free markets, we all benefit. No, I'm going to give what you do and you do what for me and you import for me, and this is a different frame of mind, and I think it's very dangerous, both from an economic point of view, and then to go from there to war is almost just a logical step forward.
Fantastic. I'm conscious of time. We've been an hour and 24 minutes enjoying your knowledge, and I hope that people feel that they've learned a lot. When we start opening a debate of a complex subject like the one of today, we feel that we've learned a lot, but we still need to learn much more because of the complexity of the topic that we were dealing with it today. Let me finish saying that in the last question that Mark Sanderson was asking about what is stopping the economies once we are supposed to have a vaccine that cures the population, what is stopping us to going back to normal? I suppose that we now have to wake up tomorrow and hope that the virus is overcome. We've got the tests, we've got vaccines, that the economies have a way to recover. And I did like a lot the phrase that Neil mentioned. And now, once we generate the money, Can we use it better? Can we properly learn from what is happening and pay more attention to the debate of geopolitics and to the innovation and the scientific investment, which some of the countries we've been discussing today probably have a long way to go to do better. Thank you, Neil and Mike. We've really enjoyed every minute of this conversation. I hope that it's been enlightening and useful for the business audience that we've got. The British Chamber is at your disposal for future occasions in which we can collaborate. Thank you all the participants. And remember that in the British Chamber website, in the upcoming events, we've got webinars every week. I can't promise that all of them are going to be to this level, but we also have to sometimes talk about more down-to-earth topics. Thank you, everybody.